Hello and welcome to another video on Power and Conflict Poetry, which is section B of paper 2. In this video we're going to be looking at the poem Exposure. All the information is going to be on the PowerPoint, and you can stop the video at each different point and make sure that you get the notes down that you need for this poem. You need to make sure that you've got a copy of the poem in your Power and Conflict Poetry anthology, and you should have read the poem at least twice beforehand. You can always go online and find a video of the poem being read to you, and sometimes that helps you to hear the expression and the intonation in the poem. So let's have a look then at this poem, Exposure. Firstly, we need to start off with a little bit of information about the poet Wilfred Owen himself. He was a frontline soldier and he died in battle in World War I, and he often wrote about the harsh realities of war. He was known as a war poet and wrote a number of poems about war. The title of the poem Exposure is a really good place to start because there's lots of connotations to this word exposure. In the poem, the soldier is exposed to the weather and the elements, but he's also exposed to the danger of the war zone or a battlefield, and he is exposed and vulnerable. Owen was also interested in exposing the truth about war and sort of really warning society and maybe future generations about the misery and the harsh realities of war. So this is always a really good place to start. And again, it's really important that we have that key information about Owen so we can write about Assessment Objective 3 context and also write in an engaged way about the writer's ideas and maybe why they were writing about what they were writing about. Let's have a look at verse 1 and verse 2 then. So you can see them in the box at the top left. I'm not going to read them to you, and as we talked about with bayonet charge, there's no way that you're going to remember and learn everything about every poem. So you only need to focus on the highlighted bits here. The first quotation, our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us in verse 1, has lots of interesting bits that we can pick up on, and they're listed in that second box on the right hand side. The phrase brains ache has connotations of mental illness and also the fatigue of the soldiers. And this is interesting because it goes against what we might expect. This is not about physical injuries, but about the psychological impact of war. The winds here are described as merciless, meaning they are showing no mercy. They are cruel and relentless. That means non-stop. There's nowhere for the soldiers to escape. And in this way, the writer, Owen, is using personification. Nature here is the enemy and is powerful, and the soldiers are powerless against this force. What's also interesting is the verb knive. This is what the winds are doing, attacking them violently. And this is also then that sort of metaphorical speak here. In the whole phrase, we can also see sibilants. We've got merciless, iced, east, winds, us. So the C sound and the S sound are both contributing to this sibilance. We could also say that this is auditory imagery, and it could represent the hissing noise of the winds. Again, the sound repeats over and over again in the same way that the wind is relentless. We can also then it helps the reader to imagine the wind as sharp and stinging. And this line's also really difficult to say because of that repetition of the S sound. And we could say that this reflects the difficulty of the soldiers' lives in the trenches. In this way, we're giving an alternative interpretation because we've got two different things that we can say here. Overall, we can say that even nature has become something that we fear. And normally we think of things as natural things as something good. But in this case, that's the opposite. We might also want to pick out some of these words that are highlighted in green here. And this really helps to establish how the soldiers are feeling from the beginning. They're wearied, they're worried, and they're nervous. So straight away we can see that Owen is trying to focus on the feelings of the soldiers. He presents them as sentient beings. This means that they are capable of feeling a range of emotions, and they are not machines. Now this again may go against our perceptions of soldiers. We think they're brave and heroic, and actually he's trying to normalise them and saying that they're not immune to this range of human feelings. And this way again he's exposing them as vulnerable. Remember, the title of this poem is Exposure. What you should also notice straight away in these first two verses is we've got 4 quite long lines followed by a short 5th line. And this phrase, "but nothing happens," repeats throughout the poem. So in this way we can talk about this phrase, "but nothing happens," as anaphora, because it's a repeated phrase. Here in the second verse we can see it change to "what are we doing here?" And we've got this rhetorical question which really echoes bayonet charge. And each verse, the long lines build to then this very short 5th line. It's almost like a bit of an anticlimax. They think something's going to happen and then it doesn't. And this reflects how Owen felt that war was futile. Futile means that it's pointless. He's trying to show how the soldiers are waiting for action, but that action never comes. And it contrasts our stereotypical view of war. There's actually a lack of conflict in this poem. The only conflict is with the weather. In the second verse, this 5th line is a rhetorical question, and it shows that Owen is questioning himself. He feels a lack of purpose, and he doesn't know what he's doing there. And the fact that this 5th line keeps repeating over and over again reminds us that war keeps repeating. Maybe Owens is trying to suggest that we keep making the same mistakes all over again. You might want to pause it here if you haven't done so already, whilst you get all your notes down. Moving on to lines 3 and verses 3 and 4, we're going to focus on again these just particular highlighted lines. We're not going to worry about the rest of it. In verse 3 we can see that it's morning. Dawn is mentioned twice. So we've gone from the night time in verses 1 and 2, and now the soldiers are waking up. The morning is described using military language, and we've got this kind of semantic field of military here. We've got words like massing, army, ranks, and even grey could kind of reflect the uniform of the soldiers, and that builds to then bullets as well in the 4th verse. Even Mother Nature is now a threat, and we often think of nature as Mother Nature, this kind of maternal image, but in this sense nature is attacking, and the rain is seen as an enemy to the soldiers. The fact that it's attacking once more again reinforces this idea that the weather is relentless and the soldiers are not able to escape it. We might want to talk about the idea of Dawn being personified here, so again making her seem like the enemy, like it's a battle between the soldiers and the weather. And also Dawn is able to mass in the east, so we've got a sense of her scale and power, and the word ranks is repeated, ranks on shivering ranks, again suggesting the amount of rain that's coming or the amount of enemies in comparison to the soldiers, again helping to create sympathy for them. In verse 4 we get our first only bit of action, and it says sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. Again that sibilance is coming in, recalling the howling wind that was mentioned earlier. The sibilance could also be the sound of bullets whizzing past. It could be the sound of the soldiers shivering, but either way it creates a very sinister tone. And again we can try and give a range of interpretations when we're talking about the effect of that sibilance. The fact that the bullets are sudden again echoes the beginning of bayonet charge, and shows us that the soldiers are unprepared. War is unpredictable and they never know what's coming next. The bullets are also successive, suggesting that they're continuous and there's no break for the soldiers. They are always under attack, whether it's from the weather or from the enemy. Pause here and make sure you've got your notes on those 3 lines. Moving on to verses 5 and 6, the weather is still attacking during verse 5, and the line that we're going to focus on is pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. So here again the weather is still attacking. It's moved from the rain now to snow, so it's getting colder and colder. Again, the weather is being personified, and it's described as stealthy, as if it's sly. Nature is tricking them. And this could echo the idea that Owen feels that he has been tricked by the government in going to fight this war. The F sound here, this repeated sound here, is called fricative alliteration. That's alliteration using an F sound or a V sound. It often gives an airy or breathless quality, and here it could be seen as quite calming and comforting, especially the way it's kind of caressing the soldiers' faces and stroking their faces. But in actual fact, this links to later on in the poem when the soldiers feel that they're going to freeze to death. And this is where we get this idea that nature has tricked them. It seems to be providing comfort, but ultimately it's going to lead to their deaths. There's quite a shift in verse 6 when the soldiers start thinking about returning home. And we're going to focus on these two lines here. What's interesting about them both is the way that we've got this colon to divide up the lines. And we're just going to focus on half of each. Slowly our ghosts drag home, colon. The ghosts here is a noun and also a metaphor because they're not literal ghosts, although some of them might be if they lost their life on the battlefield. But what's really being suggested here is that the soldiers feel like they have been destroyed. They're not literally dead, but they are metaphorically dead. They're also dragging themselves home slowly. And we've got two interesting words to explore here that link. Slowly is an adverb and drag is a verb. And obviously this kind of connotations of slowness are echoed throughout the poem and how long it is. Even the poem seems to drag on. These words could suggest this idea of weariness, that the soldiers have lost their purpose in life. They've lost their way. And it also reflects the boredom and frustration that they felt when they were out on the battlefield, just waiting for any conflict to begin. The fact that they're dragging themselves home could suggest that actually they don't want to return home. And that might seem a bit strange. Surely they'd be desperate to leave the battlefield. So what we could say here is maybe, or perhaps it's suggesting that it's difficult for them to return to normal life after that time on the battlefield. They feel like they don't belong. And so we get this idea that they've been really changed by the experience. The colon on both lines creates a physical barrier between the soldiers and their experience and the rest of society. And we see that picked up in this line here. On us, the doors are closed. The soldiers are united. We've got this inclusive pronoun here, us, and they feel separated from the rest of the world. Metaphorically, they feel shut off. So the doors are closed here as a metaphor, and society is very much divided. Maybe it could suggest that they feel that they've been forgotten, or that no one understands what they've been through. But the colon in both of these lines is presenting a physical barrier between the soldiers and life at home. And then finally we get to verse 7 and verse 8. In verse 7, Owen is really exploring the reasons why people go to war and this sense of purpose. The final line in this verse is, "For the love of God seems dying." We get quite a lot of religious imagery in this verse. We can see it here. Owens was religious, and he had originally pursued a career as a vicar before he went to war. He didn't for various reasons, which we won't go into now, but he felt that he had a moral duty to protect people at home. So he was very principled, and he felt that he had a real reason to go and protect his fellow men. We see the soldiers here almost like Jesus, and they are suffering to save humanity, and they're giving up a massive sacrifice. And we see that here in terms of, this is why he says he's going to war, so that the sun can continue to smile on child, field, or fruit. But those reasons for why he went to war seem to be getting a bit lost, and he seems to be losing his faith. And when he says, "For love of God seems dying," it suggests that his belief in God is fading. Maybe alongside his belief in God is fading, his reasons for fighting are fading too. So we get a real sense that the soldiers are losing hope. This word dying again is really interesting because it's not just their faith and their ideas that are dying, but this idea that this is their destiny. By dying, they are fulfilling God's purpose. But also maybe there's an idea that they want to die here because it would be an end to the torture of life in the trenches. And we can talk about this life being interminable. That means that it is never ending. We get to verse 8. and it returns to night time. And this links us back to the beginning of the poem that started at night. And we get this sense then that time just carries on day after day. So the poem ends in the way that it began, and it's reinforcing this idea of the relentlessness and monotony of life in the trenches. There's other ideas that repeat here. So as well as nighttime, the motif of time, we've also got the word ice. In the beginning it was the merciless iced east winds, and now the soldiers' eyes are iced. What they're doing here, as night falls and they feel that they're going to be kind of caked in frost, the burying party would be the people who went to collect the dead soldiers. And as they do, they pause over half-known faces. The idea that their eyes have become ice suggests that they've also almost sort of glazed over. They've become cold-hearted or emotionless, or almost numb to the other's suffering. And again, this reminds us of the phrase numb as a smashed arm in Bayonet Charge. Again, we get this idea that nature has won. They are starting to give up against this kind of force of nature. And finally, again, we get this refrain or this anaphora, but nothing happens. And actually, this is where we get this idea that they'd probably rather die. They can't even manage to do that. Pause the video here if you are still needing to write down any notes. But the quotations that we've highlighted give you plenty to write about, and you really won't need to write about any more because you can't possibly remember it all. Let's have a look at some of the other ideas in the poem then. The structure of this poem is also really interesting, and students don't tend to write about structure that much. Look at the length of this poem and the length of the lines on the page. Owen has done this deliberately because it reflects the monotony and the tedium of war. Tedium really means how boring it is, the boringness, and the poem just goes on and on the way that the war does. He reinforces this idea with the use of ellipsis, those 3 dots that we see on the end of some of the first lines. And again, this makes the lines physically drag on just in the same way that war does. The other thing that's really interesting about this poem to do with the structure is the rhyme scheme. The first and the fourth lines rhyme in each verse, and the second and the third lines, but they don't always quite rhyme. So we have nivus and nervous, silent and salient, and we can call these rhymes half rhymes or para rhymes. What we can say about the effect of these rhymes is they create a sense of unease and unpredictability, and therefore the rhymes reflect Owen's idea about war. The soldiers never knew when they were going to be attacked, in the same way we never quite know whether the rhymes, how they're going to sit, how they're going to feel, because they don't sound quite right. So the reader then begins to anticipate the rhyme scheme just in the same way that the soldier is anticipating battle, but then it's always cut short by that shorter line in verse 5, in line 5 that doesn't rhyme. The shortness of that line 5 compared to lines 1 to 4 also really puts this idea of contrast across. We've already mentioned this idea of it building towards an anticlimax, but the shorter 5th line could also reflect how the soldiers' lives are cut short. If you're able to make a couple of points about structure along with picking out some ideas about language, it's really going to show the examiner that you've got a solid understanding of this poem. So let's try and bring together the writer's ideas. What was Owen trying to achieve here? He wanted to expose the harsh realities of war. He wanted the poem to serve as a warning to others. He wanted to highlight the plight of the soldiers as sentient beings, not fighting machines, and also their suffering. And finally, he wanted to remind us of the futility of war. They were never going to win these soldiers against a force as great as nature or the weather, as we see in the poem. And that might suggest that attitude towards war as well, that really they were bound to fail from the start. This poem then in context of the other 15 poems in the Power and Conflict cluster. This poem definitely fits into the theme of power and powerlessness. The soldiers have very little power, nature is massively powerful. And because of the repeated images to do with nature, obviously we can write about it in relation to nature. We've got conflict with the weather and the lack of military conflict in the poem. We can link it to other poems about soldiers and the identity of the soldiers. The soldiers maybe don't match with our perceptions of what soldiers should be like because they're presented as much more vulnerable. And in this way, you could even write about this poem then in relation to poems like Checking Out My History. It fits really well with Prelude, which Charge of the Light Brigade, and with Bayonet Charge. And you don't need to note all these things down, but it's just worth thinking about which poems match with which ones best. Finally, you can use these slides to help you revise. So it's not just enough to sit and watch the video and make notes. You might want to leave this slide up, or you might want to take a picture of it, or you might want to turn it into a flashcard. So on the left-hand side, you've got 10 prompts. Try to use these prompts to write as much as you can about each prompt or the key words without looking at your notes. So we know that the last lines in each verse are important, but what would you say? We know that the poem includes personification of nature, but what are the quotes? Or what would you say? We know that the use of ellipsis and colon creates particular effects, but what are those effects? And so on and so on. So these are the sort of ideas that you can put on a flashcard and then use to help you talk or write about the poem as part of your revision. Alternatively, you can use the quotations, and again, you can keep that slide up or you can take a picture of it, and then you can practice writing or talking about those quotations. What would you say about each one? Or you can practice trying to learn them from memory. You do not need any other quotations from this poem apart from the ones on that slide. And even those, if you knew 3 or 4 of them, would probably give you plenty to write about. Finally then, just a reminder of how to revise. I'm not going to talk through this slide, but there's lots of suggestions there of what you can do once you've watched the video and made notes. And you need to keep coming back to these revision activities regularly. I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any questions or you want any further information, please pick it up with your teacher.